Welcome to Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Gloria Lee will be speaking about ecological goods and services from an Indigenous perspective. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we get going, I'd like to mention that we have 2 more webinars coming up for Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Tomorrow's webinar is about pollination, and it'll be followed by a webinar on Friday about carbon sequestration. You can register for these webinars on the PCAP website. Just click on upcoming events and then Prairie's Got the Goods Week. All past webinar presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel, and this webinar will be uploaded there in the near future as well. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time. And if you're on a cell phone app, you can send it by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Enbridge and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsors are Eco-Friendly West, Information Services Corporation, and Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. So a bit about today's presenter. Gloria Lee is of Cree and Métis heritage. She grew up in the Cheetah Lake area with a large extended family. She has worked effectively with First Nation communities for over 20 years in areas of economic development, child welfare, land policy, justice services, education, and treaty governance. Her work is guided by the teachings and values of the grandmothers and her mother, whose teachings and values were communicated through story and everyday activities, picking berries, medicines, fishing, hunting, and trapping. The connection to the land was so embedded into everyday activity, it was not until she started living in the city where she recognized the vast difference in lifestyle and the values of the people around her. Gloria is the mother of 4 adult children. She's an artist and an explorer of ideas and pedagogies. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Gloria.
Hello, thank you for that. That's a beautiful introduction. And I'm so appreciative that you did a land acknowledgement right off the bat. That was really awesome, and I congratulate you in doing so. So thank you for inviting me, and hello everybody. I'm going to just talk for a little bit. I'm going to, first of all, introduce myself a little bit briefly. Then I'm going to talk about why the land acknowledgement. And then I'm going to go back and talk a little bit more about my life experience. And then I'm going to share a little bit about history and treaty. And I have a couple of pieces of information. I can show you a diagram. I can also share with you a website that you can go and explore on your own time. But there's a treaty timeline on that website that I want to be able to just show you briefly. And I'm going to talk to you then a little bit about, you know, as an Indigenous person, my connection to the land and why it's so important to me still, and what we can learn about our relationship to the land. So first of all, I'm just going to just introduce myself a little bit. You heard my brief introduction. So how I grew up, you know, as it was mentioned, with a large extended family, we lived in around the Cheetah Lake area. Some of you might know Cheetah Lake or Pelican Lake. So many of my relatives are from the Pelican Lake First Nation. So on my mother's side, I'm Cree, and then on my father's side, I'm Métis and Cree. So on my father's side, his grandfather was one of the first Métis settlers that had a homestead in what is now the provincial park north of Prince Albert. So my great grandfather, I guess it would be, was known as he was a Lavallee. So that's on my Métis side. So that's a little bit about sort of my ancestry. But when I was a kid, we were, you know, my uncle had a farm on the reserve, and he was known at one point as the largest First Nations, or at the time they called them Indian, farming operation, producing both cattle and wheat. And he employed the young men from the reserve on his farming operation. And so I spent a lot of time working on the farm. And when we weren't working on the farm, we were out in the bush or out on the land collecting medicines. So one of the medicines I can tell you would have been a thing called Cinnakaroot. And Cinnakaroot is a plant that grows, well, it grows amongst the trees on hilly locations. And it was really valued by pharmaceutical companies, and we would pick it and sell it by the pound in large gunny sacks. So as kids and the women, that was something we did. You know, that was an activity that we did, was pick Cinnakaroot, and we would sell that. But other things that we would pick and use in everyday practice or in ceremonies would be sweetgrass. And you probably know what sweetgrass looks like. I have an unbraided bundle here I can kind of show you. It's quite long and has purple roots. It's pretty long. So that's an unbundled, unbraided little bundle of sweetgrass that I picked last year. And then what we do with it is we braid it like this. This is a simple braid. And this is a dry braid of sweetgrass. And we use this sweetgrass in prayer and ceremony. So it's burned, it has a sweet smell to it, why it's called sweetgrass, I suppose. And we use the smoke to cleanse the energy from us and prepare us for prayer, prepare us for meditation, and clean off any of the negative energy before we go into an important conversation, before we go into ceremony, or before we start a prayer or a gathering with people. You'll see there'll be somebody going around with a little smudge pan, and there'll be sage and sweetgrass and cedar. And so sage and sweetgrass and cedar are often used in combination. And we also use a fourth plant, which is tobacco. Tobacco is used as an offering on the ground or in a fire to Creator, to hear our prayers, as we start a ceremony, or as we open a gathering up for the people there to work together in a good way. So those are the kinds of, it's positive energy that we're looking for to help guide us. And so we have this relationship with Creator. So all of that was sort of learned and practiced in every day as a kid, growing up with my aunts and uncles, and I had lots of cousins, and we all worked together. Whenever we'd go berry picking, or if we went fishing, we were always sort of in a big group of us together. It's funny now when I think about it, but we all go together to do those things, and make light work. Many hands make light work. I'm sure you've heard that. And so we often did that together as a family group. So those were the things that I was very connected to as a young person. And then we moved into the city. My dad, of course, became an electrician and had jobs in different locations. And so we were pulled away from that family, and we ended up living in the city. And then as I became more self-aware and I entered education, like post-secondary education, I began to notice that people didn't practice those things that we talked about, or that we learned, or that we exercised ourselves regularly. I started recognizing that there was embarrassment or shame, and that knowledge was sort of hidden and tucked away. And as I progressed through my education, my post-secondary education, I have a bachelor in law and I have a bachelor in arts and science. But through my arts and science education and degree, I started to see that a lot of my Indigenous counterparts from different parts of Saskatchewan and prairie areas and were sort of embarrassed about their Indigenous identity and background. And I didn't have that same embarrassment. And now, as I look back, I understand the different ways that we grew up within our communities and within our families, whether they instilled pride and a sense of, you know, belonging, or whether another family experienced a sense of needing to hide who you were and what your family knew about the natural laws and the teachings of Creator that were communicated through ceremony, song, and dance, and is also embedded within our Indigenous languages. So my mother is a fluent Cree speaker, and I'm what they call a silent speaker. I can understand what's being said for the most part, but I don't speak it in return. So I'm trying to learn how to speak my language, even though I can understand, and when I'm hearing it, I know what's being said. So there's lots of challenges that Indigenous people have because of a disconnection that was created through education system, the whole colonization process, and a number of policies that the federal government imposed on First Nations people, communities, and families. And there's lots of examples, and I'm going to go through a web link with a timeline in a minute and kind of point out some of those things for you. You can look at those again later. But I first want to share with you a diagram. So I'm going to show my screen here. Hopefully you can see this. And let's see. It's saying that I'm sharing my screen. I hope you can see that.
Yes, we can.
Okay. What I want to do is maybe zoom in a little bit, maybe make it a little bit easier for you to see. I don't know how much I can adjust, but at the top of this diagram, it says First Nations Historical Worldview. This diagram is available on the Indigenous Cultural Center. It was prepared by Judy Bear with permission of elders. So it's made available for people to see. And so I'm sharing something with you that's already public, to help sort of explain like our Indigenous worldview. There's some Cree language in here, but you'll notice at the top, it says, as long as the sun shines, the grass grows and the water flows. That line is in reference to treaty. So this is why I wanted to show you the timeline. So before, colonization, which is European people arriving to North America, Indigenous people had their own teachings, laws, values. They had whole systems in place. They had their own medicine and medicine people. They had specialists in every field that you can imagine. And these professionals, we'll call them, in that Indigenous world view, would be designated by the elders who recognize a certain gift or talent, and then they would be trained in that particular area, whether it was medicines, whether it was crafting and creating tools. When somebody demonstrated a skill or an ability that was natural to them, they were encouraged and taught further, and they would become an expert, I guess, in that field. So there was a real appreciation for individual gifts that people had, and some of those would be like medicine people. So my grandmother, my mom's mother, she never spoke English. She never had running water or electricity. They never owned a vehicle. They only traveled around by team of horses. She was a midwife and a medicine woman, and her specialization for medicine was babies and pregnant women that were going to be having a baby. So she knew the medicines to work with women. So people would come to her, even as I was a young girl. People would come to her for help for medicine if they were pregnant or if they were going to have a baby. He was the midwife that helped bring children into the world and help the mother along in recovery afterwards. So she would be very knowledgeable in plants, medicines. And so you'll see there in the middle of the diagram, at the top it says creator. So everything flows from creator or God. And so the elements of part of that worldview are the sun, Mother Earth, the moon, and the stars. Plant life that comes directly from Mother Earth, and those are gifts from Creator. And there's stories for numerous plants, how they arrived. The stories would indicate what those medicines were for, and even what the proper way was to harvest that plant. There are old stories about that. So all of that is within that language. So around plant life and medicines, children were all taught about tobacco and sweetgrass, sage, and cedar. And they were taught about how to properly look after and not over harvest, to respect the natural world. Those would have been the very first teachings that everybody would have received as children. And then out of that, you start to see people's specialization as children. So in prayers, all of these things are acknowledged in a prayer, an opening prayer. The plant life, small animals, water and sky, and everything that lives on the land, the two-legged, the four-legged. So bison, elk, moose, deer, all of those animals are acknowledged. And you'll notice on my diagram here at the very bottom is humanity. So people are not at the top, they're at the bottom. We're dependent on everything else. Nothing needs us to survive. We're the least needed thing on earth, unfortunately. We're the least needed thing on earth. And we depend on everything else on earth, the plants, the animals, the water, the air, and all the large creatures that we live off of. We rely on all those things being able to function in balance so we have access to food, shelter, water, and clean land. We need those things as people. So our Indigenous people understood these sacred teachings and natural laws long before anybody else ever arrived within our territories. And settlers started to come in. The people knew those newcomers were coming, and they were told to prepare because the spirits in ceremony were telling the elders, guiding them and informing them that these people would come and take the land, and prepare yourself. Life would become hard. So treaties became part of that preparation. And so the treaties were really about how we were going to live on the land together to reduce the suffering of all people. The treaty wasn't supposed to be one on top of the other. It was supposed to be that we walk together and share in the land. So there's all kinds of teachings, and our Cree language has words for those things because they were of primary importance for us to live together on the land with the plants, with the animals, to have clean water and to keep the land pure and clean for future generations. So this is the other part of our Cree worldview. Not only do we acknowledge our ancestors who have passed on into the spirit world, but we also acknowledge future generations yet to be born. And that balance, to address our respect and how we live our lives here, is to say that we need to leave, the land and the water in a clean state for all the future generations that are yet to come. So to think about that, my ancestors were already thinking of me many, many years ago, prior to treaty, during treaty time, that they were going to understand that life was going to be hard, and they were leaving a legacy of treaty and of these teachings in medicines and ceremony and song and dance, so that I could learn the balance and the importance of it. So, you know, we rely on the land and the plants for our survival. And our sacred teachings and our ceremonies, even just burning the sweetgrass. I have a sweetgrass here that I burned a little bit just before we started. Is a reminder. I cleansed myself of any negative energy so that I could speak in a good way to help you understand and help you learn something that I might be able to share with you today. So I did that before we started. And that plant comes from the clean land. And before I pick that plant, I put tobacco down and give thanks. And then I pick the sweetgrass so that we can use it. So I follow, I guess, the protocol or the teachings around this medicine before I make use of it. And I make use of it in a good way for all of us, for myself and for you all who are listening today. So that's my relationship and how I understand my world. And some of that's been imposed on through history, right? So the next thing I want to show you, and if there's any questions, Caitlin, you can find them. I'm going to go find my other web link that I want to share today, if I can find it.
Sure, take your time. We don't have any questions yet.
Okay.
Yeah, but it looks like we can see your web link already.
Okay, great. So I'm not going to go through every single one, but I want to touch on a few things in this timeline. Now, this timeline's a little bit faint. It's hard to read, but it's available on the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. And there's a ton of resources on there. But one of the most valuable things I've always used there was this timeline. So in the timeline, going all the way back to 1763, right now it's showing us pre-contact, but it talks a little bit about Weniskiwin. It says that Indigenous people have inhabited Saskatchewan for more than 10,000 years. Some of you might be familiar with Weniskiwin. It's talking about in Canada, over 500 nations, etc. And it's pinpointing some European contact in North America, not particularly in our region, but on the shores of North America around 1400. And there's even more recent research that shows it may have been even much sooner than that. But I guess we're learning as we go. So it acknowledges Christopher Columbus. Most of you will know about Christopher Columbus because that's something that's taught in the school curriculum. Christopher Columbus was sent, and other explorers were sent with the authority of God. So the churches sanctioned the exploration and the taking of lands and resources over the ocean, so over to North America, with the authority of God, which was basically called the doctrine of discovery. It's actually referred to as the doctrine of Christian discovery. And that's the point of conflict when the church view an Indigenous spiritual connection to Mother Earth came into conflict when these explorers started to come to North America. So that's an important timeline, just to sort of give you a little tip of what to look at. It talks about Hudson's Bay Company and you know, how the Hudson's Bay Company came into the Saskatchewan area about 1690. So there's some good historical information here. But what I would like to sort of get us to this point here, which is King George III was very involved in sort of the pre-treaty era, you know, making that connection, that relationship with Indigenous people. And again, at this point in time, you would have the doctrine of Christian discovery, which gave authority, you know, their authority, not our Indigenous authority. We were not inviting anybody here at all, but it gave those explorers authority in the name of the crown. And so at that time, it was King George III. And there's something called the honor of the crown. And so there's even a definition of what that is. And so when they came and were being introduced to the Indigenous people, they started giving gifts and acknowledging that Indigenous people had title to the lands in North America. And that is established in the Royal Proclamation 1763. From there, we're starting to see treaties with the crown. So the leaders of the Indigenous people, the chiefs and headmen, with the crown's representative, the agent, the treaty commissioner at the time, made these agreements. And these are the agreements I talked about, how to live on the land in peace and sharing, so that they could live together. And we really haven't seen, I guess, a full implementation of that principle. We have yet to achieve it. So there's a series of treaties that started in Eastern Canada. And I'm not going to go through the whole treaty history, but here in Treaty 6 territory, it talks about the War of 1812 and all of that. But here in the prairies, the Treaty 6 territory, again, the First Nations people knew that there was going to be newcomers coming in for farmland, to farm the land. And so they agreed, because it was already happening in Eastern Canada, farming of the land. So the Indian people knew about that. They were well informed. So they agreed in the treaty to the depth of a plow. And you'll have heard that probably in different conversations, that the Indian people only agreed to share the land to the depth of a plow so that the newcomers could farm wheat. And that was the purpose of them coming to settle in the area. So that is one of the agreements and the understandings of treaty, and the value and the importance of land. So land for Indigenous people has been a real contentious issue, because the treaty implementation is not complete. The treaty interpretation is always varied. And so there's Supreme Court case law around interpretation of treaty. So this conversation is ongoing, as you can appreciate. So I want to talk a little bit about what we can do going forward from treaty. The people understood that there was going to be farmers coming in. The treaties and the commissioners needed to remove the Indian people from the land, because you need clear land from people and animals to be able to farm properly. So the bison were killed off. That took less than 20 years to kill off the bison. Once the bison, of which there were millions, then it was easier to settle the Indians onto reserves. So about 2/3 of what the original reserve land that was supposed to be set aside for First Nations, about 2/3 of that was pulled back by the federal government between about 1890 to about 1923, in there somewhere. So this is why we now have treaty land entitlement and land claims, because the federal government did that without communicating or consulting with the First Nations. They just went ahead and did it. So it ignored the treaty at the time. The Indian people agreed not to um, not to fight with the newcomers, to let them farm in peace. And the First Nations people were supposed to get stuff in return. And so those things are still not happening. You know, things like medicine and education. And so when people hear about education or housing or those issues, those are long-standing issues that were assured in treaty time, but later the federal government reneged by taking that land back from the reserves. So now you have all these treaty land settlements and treaty claims and so forth happening. Sometimes they're referred to as cows and plows. One of the treaty um, one of the treaty terms was because the bison were no more, the people needed a way to live. You know, their livelihood had been removed. They didn't have access to the land because they were pushed into reserves, and they lost their main source of food, clothing, medicine, and shelter, which was the bison. So the replacement was these treaty terms, which was education, medicine, shelter. Those are the terms, and agriculture. So Indians were meant to receive, there's even exact terms about the cattle and the farmland and a plow and ammunition and a gun, you know, so to help First Nations people adapt to this sudden change, you know, being pushed off your land into a small corner that was not really ecologically useful to sustain human life. So the people were really under pressure. That was a forced migration from the vastness of the prairies onto these very small reserves. They had to learn to live together, where before they were able to move freely and hunt and fish and trap wherever. Um, so they had to find a way to live on those reserves, and getting agricultural implements to learn how to become a farmer, and even being trained how to grow wheat. Indian people never had to grow wheat. They hunted bison that ate the wild grasses of prairies. So they never had to grow wheat. Suddenly, there's no bison. They have to learn how to grow wheat. The treaty promised them education to learn agriculture so they could have a sustained way of life that was completely different from the way they had lived before. So those are some of that's a little bit of insight into, I guess, the treaty and the impact of not living up to treaty on First Nations people, the impact of that on the children, the families, the language, the culture, the poverty that you see. The poverty is there because those promises were never upheld. Even to this day, the battle is on to try and get education, enough funding for education. There's a real serious struggle right now within the province and Crown land so that First Nations can acquire or access enough land to farm it, to grow cattle, to grow wheat. Um, and they were pushed off of this, and even now the current provincial Crown policy keeps First Nations away from land and turns it over to non-Indigenous producers and farmers. So there is still an ongoing legacy of conflict due to the treaty not being upheld. So land is critical for survival. As we know, we're watching a fight over resources and land right now on the other side of the world. But the reality is Indigenous people have experienced this already here in their own territory. And still to this day, try to live by their teachings of balance and live by their natural law. That is how to sustain water, how to sustain land, not just for us right now in our generation to become wealthy off of, but so that future generations have a legacy of clean land, air, and water to survive, to thrive. not so much to get wealthy off of, but to be able to live the purpose of life. And from a pre-Indigenous worldview, the purpose of life is to fulfill Creator's intention, which is love. And you see love in many, many ways all around us, with relationships, with our respect that we have for animals, with our respect that we have for the plants, the respect we have for land and water. That's the purpose of life for a Cree people. It's not to become wealthy in monetary or in physical things, but it's to communicate those teachings and to express Creator's love through sharing our knowledge and teaching our children, first and foremost, and the children of our neighbors who care about the same things we care about, which is plants, animals, land, water, air, the natural world. You know, those are the things that Creator taught us is valuable, and that's what our teachings continue to communicate. So those are the things our elders talk about. They talked about them at treaty time. In sacred ceremony, they lifted the pipe, which represents honesty and truthfulness. And they spoke in a good way about the future, and they thought about us. And they were informed that people were coming to take the land and to prepare yourself. The best way our leaders and our elders knew how to prepare themselves is to hold on tightly to our teachings, to our ceremonies, to our language, to communicate these sacred teachings to our people. That's how they prepared themselves. And I think it's worked. I think now we have something of incredible value to share and to teach other people. So I think it's been a beautiful way to prepare for what has been a devastating time in history for Indigenous people who have had their lives completely turned over and have had to learn new ways to make a living, to make a livelihood for their survival. And now we find ourselves in a time of reconciliation to try and understand this history, to try and understand each other, and to share our values and our teachings and our laws with the newcomers, with the people who are descendants of the colonizers, and to try to implement those principles and those teachings of treaty. So I thank you for your time today. And I'm open for any questions, I guess. There's so much more I could talk about, but I want to give you time to think a little bit and maybe ask me some questions.
First of all, thank you so much. That was really interesting. We've had quite a few people write in a few comments and questions. The first one is from a listener named May, and she says, if I know where there is sweetgrass and sage on a healthy pasture with cows, is it still sacred?
Yes. Yes, it's only not clean if somebody's gone and blasted it with chemicals, weed killer or some insect repellent. Then it's not clean because you don't want that chemical mixed in with. You're going to be burning that, and you know you're going to be smelling that plant. You don't want chemical in it.
That makes
Just
sense.
so cows haven't pooped on your sweetgrass.
Good point. A listener named Graham says, I think a lot of our environmental problems stem from the European thought of dominion over the earth, rather than the Indigenous thought of member or part of the earth who benefit from it. Do you see a parallel between the environmental movement and Indigenous culture and values?
There are some parallels. And I think we have to be careful about saying that we're one and the same. because Indigenous people have these values and laws because they were put here on earth by Creator and given these laws to follow and these teachings to follow and implement. These are what make it sacred to Indigenous people. So this is a deep spiritual teaching about our interconnectedness with the natural environment. So scientists will tell you that every element in our body is also reflected in the earth. Indigenous people knew that long before science had to tell us that. So this is on the level of spiritual knowledge that comes directly from Creator to Indigenous people. And those teachings are in our language, our ceremonies, our songs, our dance, our artwork. So I'm careful to say that we're one and the same, although we share the same values and we understand the importance of a balanced relationship with land, water, and sky. We need those things. Those things don't need us. They will survive long beyond the time we're gone. But if any of those things fall out of the balance of our life, we will have a very short existence without water, without land, without clean air. So I think we share some common understandings, but I think how we receive them, where we believe they come from, might be a little bit different.
Thank you for that answer. We have a question here. It says, I am wondering if you can share with us any updates on any discussions between the Saskatchewan government and FSIN/treaty partners with regard to access to Crown lands now leased to settler producers for agricultural use. This is a concern for me both from an Indigenous perspective and an ecological perspective, as we learned in yesterday's webinars regarding wetland drainage. We had a full 45-minute session about wetland drainage. Do you have any comments about that, or is that something you're familiar with?
Yes, I'm deeply familiar with it. I'm reluctant to comment any further, except to say this is one of the most critical land issues facing First Nations in Saskatchewan. And we have a long way to go to build the relationship with the provincial crown to understand, you know, the importance of upholding treaty. So we have an education exercise that we need to conduct to bring our provincial counterparts to the same understanding or to understand our view. So we have a long way to go. But this is like the most critical issue right now in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question from a listener named Claudia. First of all, thank you for the very interesting historical review. Understanding is the first step to any reconciliation, and appreciation of the land and all associated resources and gifts is the first step to fully supporting land conservation. And her question is, in a perfect world, how would you approach restoration and reclamation of prairie lands to once again provide their historical abundant gifts and habitats?
Well, I think it has to be done collaboratively between Indigenous partners, federal and provincial crown, and non-Indigenous people or landholders. And I think that we need education and understanding. We can't operate under fear. We need to be thinking of the future like our ancestors thought of us long before treaty. And that says a lot for how much they thought of us. So we need to do the same thing. We owe it to our future generations to do this well and to be more understanding and patient with each other as we learn about a new process.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And Jenna is asking, are there any courses that I could take to increase my plant knowledge regarding First Nations use of plants as food and medicine? And she's a botanist for the city of Calgary and is very interested in traditional uses of plants. And her job entertains a lot of land management, but there's also a lot that she would love to learn. And I agree. I think I'm looking for resources in that topic as well. Do you have any references by chance?
I I have no references. One of the things I do right now is I develop curriculum for the law school on Indigenous traditional laws and natural law. And having the resources or knowing where to go for the information for my curriculum is a challenge. But I think that, there have been a few, I would call them naturalists or botanists, who have published books with the Indigenous name for plants,
Mhm.
and who have over the years offered the occasional workshop. To my knowledge, there isn't anything at the University of Saskatchewan that does that, or at the University of Regina, because it would be, I mean, if it did exist, we would be hearing about it. They'd be shouting about it across all the rooftops. So there isn't anything there. I mean, maybe that's something that somebody could take on as a project, to
Yeah.
collaborate with Indigenous knowledge keepers to bring that knowledge forward and more accessible.
Yeah, that's a great idea. When we do our webinars, we've been doing them for about 6 years now, and we always get people type in. We ask, are there any topics that you'd like to hear about in the future? And people always type in traditional uses of medicinal plants, and um, yeah, it would be really great to learn more about that. That's for sure. And um, your suggestion about reaching out to knowledge keepers is a great idea.
Yes, and try to collaborate and find a way to, I mean, you have to consult and collaborate. That knowledge is in the community and it should be left there. Or if
Mhm.
there's any new knowledge that's brought forward, it should be accessible to the community, to the Indigenous community for free. And they shouldn't have to go to the university and pay for it afterwards. So that's a real challenge.
That's right. That's right. And just a comment from a listener, Dodie has written in again. And to answer this question, she says, I would suggest that the botanists could approach their local Indigenous communities for collaboration and protocols for asking for sharing of this knowledge. Personal introductions and contacts are always better appreciated by knowledge keepers. So I think
Absolutely.
yeah, it's a great tip from Dodie. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, and you'd mentioned curriculum, and I just wanted to share a comment from one of our longtime listeners, Shirley. Shirley says, thank you for sharing your experiences and your understanding. I will save these websites to share and use in the future conversations with friends and family. Um, the perspective you shared today is difficult and also good to hear. I wish we could include this very full and concentrated presentation into high school curricula going forward. So thank you. So I just want to pass that on from Shirley.
Awesome. Yeah. One of
We've got a
I can just add to sort of her comment. I've taught at the university level and college level, and when I talk about residential school or colonization, decolonization, the doctrine of discovery, often both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students alike really express their anger. They feel free after they've been with me for a little while. They feel free in expressing their anger with the fact that they were never exposed to this information in high school or anywhere else, that they had to find a very specific Indigenous based class. And it's taught from an Indigenous lens, which is different than having a non Indigenous person try to communicate an Indigenous worldview.
for sure.
And so they really express their frustration that why were they never taught about this treaty history, the doctrine of discovery, um, and the church's role in colonization of the Americas. And so our own First Nations youth are as uninformed about history as our non-Indigenous youth. They they receive the same curriculum, and
Hmm.
that's what's only taught on a reserve school or in an urban or a rural school. So they're all receiving the same level of misinformation or lack of information about history because it is very uncomfortable. And I think teachers and school boards are afraid and do not like to feel uncomfortable. So that's part of the reason why this information is lacking in other places.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And then just regarding traditional uses of plants, there's been a few different comments coming in, and Jenna, the original person who asked the question, said that she has books that touch on traditional plant usage, but they're not written by First Nations authors. And it's a shame that this information isn't more readily available. And then somebody named Laura has written in that a book called The Boreal Herbal Wild Food and Medicinal Plants by Beverly Gray is a great book that involved Indigenous-led information. So I just wanted to pass that on, and it sounds like it's a really good resource there too.
Yes, that is.
And I guess there's a website that's been recommended, buffalotreaty.com, and it's a guide to Blackfoot names of plants. So that sounds like a good resource too. And we have a question from Kyle. At the time of European settlement, the predominant view of the settler would have held humans at the top of the hierarchy instead of at the bottom. It's taken the agnostic lens of science to show the environmental impacts of this view. How might modern society discover the spiritual connect that seems necessary to value a healthy environment?
Well, so within our Indigenous language, when that language, there's always like a root word. You know, like when you're learning Latin, which I did take a Latin class at university because I thought it'd be so cool, but it taught me more about linguistics, how language functions or how it's structured. So in a root word, a core word, um, every component of that word sort of has an explanation or a story or like I guess I guess the only way I can explain is like there's a story connected to a word. So when you're learning a language, like an Indigenous language, you might be studying one word, but off that one word will come a number of teachings or stories. Inside those stories or teachings, they're communicating some very basic truths. Those basic truths are the connecting point between us as humans and the rest of creation. And so those things can be found inside the language. Um, for me, exploring my own language has been a way to understand those truths that what I was taught as a young person, being away from the land and being away from the language and my cultural family for a good chunk of my life because of education and career, and now returning to that in the last 10 or 15 years. It's been a real exploration and affirmation of what it was my grandmother taught me, the simple truths of the very fundamental natural laws, and our place in the universe is so small. um, and it's teachings about being humble, understanding your powerful role, but also understanding, that we're the least of things in the natural world. So, yeah, I think for me anyway, as an Indigenous person, it's through learning those things through language, learning the language again.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I know we're running tight on time here. We have lots and lots of questions and comments coming in, so we probably won't get to them all, but that's okay. Tracy says, what types of Indigenous information or inputs can be incorporated into habitat restoration and reclamation related to actual on-the-ground work?
Oh gosh. Well, there's so many things on the ground work because the First Nations people say that they belong to the land, they don't own the land. So some of the most basic truths that can be incorporated are the basic teachings about Mother Earth and that relationship. So if you walk on the land and you understand and you learn to focus, or let's call it meditation, you can start to feel a different energy on the land. And people who spend a good deal of time on the land will affirm that that's true, that happens. So if you spend a good deal of time on the land, and you'll often hear Indigenous people say, I need to go to the land, I need to go to the bush. They're looking for that connection again. Because being away from that, being in the city with your job, your education, you lose that feeling that you can only get by being out on the land, out on the water, out in the trees. It's those quiet moments where you feel like you're not really alone. There is a connection there to something else. And so I think having students or people that are interested in sort of the science of the thing, um, to add to that experience, to have them feel that connection to the land, which for some people, it can be a long journey. And for others, it's right there within a day or two, you feel that again. So I think being able to incorporate those experiences, land-based teachings is what the modern world now calls it in the education system. Well, those were things that were just natural to us as kids when we were working with our families, fishing, hunting, trapping, picking berries, picking medicine. Those things were just natural to us.
For
Yeah.
sure. We have a couple people who have written in about traditional plant use. And Diana says there are economically motivated organizations and entrepreneurs who continually seek this information. And we've seen it so much taken and exploited, and elders remain careful about sharing that knowledge widely. And Claudia has commented that there's a lot of risk of it being pirated and misused. And so there are protocols for sharing and teaching, and it's essential to protect this knowledge. And so kind of working with elders and knowledge keepers, there's protocols in place for that reason. So just to go along the lines, I think this will probably be our final question here from Sarah. How does a person of settler descent seek to be better educated about the teachings of this land without overstepping on the fact that some of this knowledge is sacred and perhaps not meant to be shared with outsiders? Also recognizing that Indigenous people are trying to bring these teachings back to their own people. Is there a place of a settler to be taught these teachings?
Gosh, it depends on what your role and intention is, and
Mm-hmm.
knowing that you can't really get away with anything in this world. So in our worldview, um, there is a hierarchy, first of all. There's a hierarchy of knowledge and of people who have access to certain things. So just because information exists out there doesn't mean anybody can just come and take it and use it and have it and call it their own. You have to earn it. You have to pay for it. And I don't mean pay for it by money. I mean pay for it through ceremony, sacrifice, offerings, um, that kind of pay for it. You have to earn it in the spiritual world to be able to even access it. So there's a couple of things in that question that I would also address, and the points that were made earlier about, you know, some people misusing the knowledge for commercial purposes. I think while it's good to build a relationship with elders about the knowledge, I know of instances where that's happened over decades, building up a relationship and then the trust being broken. And it's devastating to Indigenous people when that happens. But I think we need to go further. I think we need an Indigenous intellectual and cultural property regime that protects Indigenous knowledge for its rightful purpose and use, which is for Indigenous people. And I think that needs to be developed, and that's also something that I'm advocating to happen, to create that, because Canada does not really have any sort of intellectual property regime that protects Indigenous knowledge and culture. So that's something that I'm looking to have further discussions with other people about.
That's great. I'm sure we could talk about this topic for a long time, but we're kind of the end of our time right now, unfortunately. But I just really wanted to sincerely thank you for the presentation. And one of our listeners, May, says, Gloria, your words were very moving. Thank you for your wisdom. So I wanted to pass that on. And I think we've all felt inspired to think differently, near and far into the future, as Claudia said here. And um, yeah, I think your presentation was very well received by our attendees. We've had a lot of comments. So thank you, Gloria. Thank you for your time
Thank you
today.
very much for inviting me today. And I hope you all, continue to follow this series. It's terrific.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you. And to all of our listeners today, thank you so much for catching our afternoon webinar. We have 2 more coming up, so please check out the PCAP website to sign up for those. When you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey that'll pop up, and we always appreciate if you can fill that out. We can report back to our funders and keep our speaker series and Prairie's Got the Goods Week going into the future. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.